Do you need to develop a logic model? In this video, I'm going to go over the Kellogg Foundation's Logic Model Development Guide and hopefully help you along the way to your logic model development process. I help organizations all the time develop logic models or theories of change as an evaluator. If you like this sort of content, make sure to subscribe. I make videos for nonprofit leaders and change makers in an effort to help them build their data and evaluation capacity. Now, this guide has 5 components to a logic model. You have resources or inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. Now, people define this differently across different organizations, different institutions. So if you see different definitions for these terms in different guides, that is why you're seeing that. It's because there isn't necessarily a common tongue among all funders or organizations. In this guide, inputs are any resources it takes to actually put on or implement your project, initiative, whatever you are doing the logic model for. It can include personnel, materials, supplies, funds, relationships, anything it takes to organize or execute on this project. Activities are techniques, tools, processes, events, technologies, pretty much anything you do. Outputs, and this is where it can get a little tricky. Outputs are the direct results of your activities. They call it the size or scope of the services you provide. I personally think it's simpler to think of outputs as the quantifications of your activities. So think of things like if you are doing something like a resource fair, it might be 1 resource fair a year, 100 participants, 300 referrals. Outcomes are changes in skills, knowledge, status, functioning, attitudes, and behavior. They organize their outcomes into short-term and long-term. Short-term meaning things or changes that might happen between 1 to 3 years after your activity, and long-term outcomes as changes that might happen between 4 to 6 years after your activity. This differs from my recommendation, and if you want more information on how I develop a logic model, I recommend looking at my video on that topic alone. And if you need a little bit more description about the difference between outcomes and outputs, I recommend you watch a video I made talking about that distinction. And finally, they have impact. Now, this differs from me again, but they define impact as the changes that might happen 7 to 10 years after your activity. So think of community changes, systems changes, organizational changes. What I really like about the Kellogg guide is that they actually call out that people make different logic models and that is okay, and that you should go with the logic model that suits your organization and your stage of thinking the best. So definitely explore your options. One type of logic model that they call out is a theoretical logic model. And this is one where you focus a lot of attention on considering the theories or principles behind your thinking, and you call out the assumptions. The next one they call out is the outcome approach, and this is actually my favorite. It's the one where you focus in on the outcomes or the changes you hope to see, and you draw causal links. And if you want an example of what this might look like as well, I recommend you check out my theory of change video where I talk about this sort of approach a little bit more. The final approach they call out is the activity approach. And this is what I would call a process map, where you list out the activities in the order you're going to implement them. And the goal here is to really be thoughtful about what's happening and when it's going to happen. It's almost like a work plan. Let me know in the comments below which sort of approach you're planning to go with. And one caveat that I'll add here is that if you're planning to steer away from the template they provide in this guide, and you were given this specific guide by a potential funder or a potential, key stakeholder, I recommend reaching out to them and clarifying if you plan to steer away from the template provided and why. And definitely, if you can't get a hold of them, I might encourage you to actually move forward with the template they provide. Just to make sure that you're not disqualified from anything because you didn't follow this template and they got a document they weren't expecting necessarily. And even though the guide says that every approach is totally welcomed, I would just make sure to clarify that and to communicate with your stakeholders. Let's get into the how-to section of our video. So one of the first things they recommend to do is to get together with a group of stakeholders to create your logic model. And I would recommend this too. People help support what they help create. So if they help you think through this process, they are more likely to be supportive of this program or project, whatever you are making this logic model for. If you're not sure what sort of stakeholders to include, I would recommend doing a stakeholder analysis and then including your key players in the development process because they are decision makers and they're interested, and then maybe asking some of your other stakeholders for feedback. In terms of which component to start with, they recommend starting with outcomes. Now remember, outcomes are the changes you hope to see. Sometimes it's difficult to think of these right off the bat. I recommend thinking of the different categories, so knowledge, attitude, behavior, skills. Think about how do you want to change attitudes and make a list of that. How do you want to change behaviors and make a list of that, and so on. And if these categories don't necessarily fit, I recommend looking at the FSG article, The Waters of Systems Change, for their 5 conditions or levers of systems change to categorize outcomes as well. And those 5 are policy, practices, resource flows, relationships, connections, power dynamics, and mental models. Another thing you should do is to consider how you're changing these things. So is it an increase or is it a decrease? After your outcomes, they recommend heading over to your outputs and completing that section, then completing your impact and your activity after that, and then ending with your inputs or resources. Once you have completed a draft, they recommend looking at your draft with a checklist in hand. And I actually really like the checklist they provide. It includes things like considering stakeholders' perspectives and did you make sure that your program is intense enough. I think the checklist is actually one of the best things in this guide. And I actually plan to incorporate it in my future work, and so I recommend you definitely checking out this template. I'll include it in the comments below. A couple caveats they offer in this framework is to include stakeholders, which I definitely agree on. They also make sure to let you know that a logic model is a work in progress. That means that it's probably never going to be perfect, and that is okay. So don't waste time trying to make it the most perfect logic model ever, as opposed to actually moving on and start implementing your work and considering how you might use the logic model. And along those lines, it's not enough to create a logic model in order to be data-driven. You actually have to use your logic model to identify which outcomes are important and what sort of data you want to collect. I've done videos in the past on how to use a theory of change to identify what data to collect, so feel free to check that out because a logic model is actually a type of theory of change. If you're interested in getting more perspectives, I recommend you check out my guide on how to develop a logic model. You can do that by joining my mailing list, and once you're on my mailing list, I'm going to send you regular resources like grant opportunities I run into. I hope this video was useful and that you liked it, so let me know by doing a like and subscribe, and comment below on what sort of program you're planning to do your theory of change or logic model on. And don't forget to check out my other videos like the one I made on a stakeholder analysis or what evaluation is.